of fucking up, is a graduate of Lewis and Clark College and holds an MFA from the University of California at Riverside. She is also the coordinator of the IWP's Between the Lines, a residential summer program that brings together aspiring writers aged 16 to 19 for creative writing and cultural exchange.
So my name is Cate and I am the author of The Fine Art of Fucking Up. So for me, character is at the heart of fiction writing. For me, it's what drives and informs every other aspect of craft, including plot. Everything for me comes from character. I understand character as a two-part animal. There's the character's presentment. That's how I always think about it. And by that, I mean the manner or the mode in which that person is presented, right? So that's all the things the character does, the way they move, the tics, their mannerisms, the way they talk, a character's sense of humor, the habits and routines, all the little details, the way she looks, her dress, her personality and sense of humor, those kinds of things, presentment, that's all kind of one part of character. And then there's everything else that's happening under the surface. So not things like her troubled childhood or the things that she wants to say but you don't actually put in dialogue. I'm talking about a bigger picture than that, which are the intellectual and emotional core of the character at the deepest level, right? So that first part of character, all those details are very multi-layered for me, and they have everything to do with detail, thinking in detail, and thinking about how and when to deploy those details for the most successful use, right? Some details are used, I think, to create a fully realized human, right? Because people are complicated and need the details. Some are for that. But others are more critical to story, and these kind of smaller details can reveal personality traits, emotions, or things that are kind of essential to the narrative arc that you're building. And then I just want to also say that smaller stuff, that first group of characterizations are also incredibly important. And I just want to note a few things about that. The key with some of these smaller things are the personal details, which is what I think of and talk about as presentment, right? The way that you're presenting the characters. You need to be not just specific, but particular, by which I mean you don't have to describe exactly necessarily the way your character looks in great detail, unless that's somehow central to your story. The reader can fill that in, but you do need to know things like the pinky side of her left hand is always covered in ink because she's a lefty and she loves the pens from the local credit union, even though they're terrible and they're inky and the ink doesn't dry quickly enough for a left-handed writer. That you have to know, right? Those kinds of details that have to do with who she is. And that's why I say you need to be particular. You need to know those intimate details, and you also need to think carefully about when to deploy them. And that's because, like any great liar, you, the writer, the fiction writer, have to convince your audience, and you'll do this with great care. The characters will become alive when they take on these details, so that's one part of it. And you can write a whole novel based on some of these specific details. But what you have to do is think about the way that you can include them that will reveal something about your story or move the concept, the construction of that character forward. So for example, it's like with dialogue. Every addition that you make should take you somewhere or should take your reader somewhere and move you forward. Maybe the strange way that a character ties their shoes indicates something about an unconventional parent or something like that. And that there's a moment when you reveal that, and that's when you include that small detail. I just want to say probably the most important thing I can about character, which will lead very quickly to a discussion of writing female characters in particular. And that is that the characters you write do not need to be nice. I want to say this really clearly. They don't need to be a friend for the reader. That's not what you're trying to think of. And no matter what you hear or if you're told it, I want to tell you, your characters don't even need to necessarily be sympathetic. They need to be interesting. They need to be compelling. We as human beings and as readers are fascinated by mistake makers. And that is what you want to write about. That's your terrain, right? The troubled, the flawed, those are the characters that you want on the page. And this leads to a little discussion about approaching character and particularly female characters. In contemporary literature, there is an ongoing discussion about likability, in particular with female characters. And it's complicated and it's a little bit of a rambling issue, but the debate is persistent. You can look at or Roxane Gay, who wrote an essay entitled Not Here to Make Friends on the importance of unlikable female protagonists. The writer Abigail Haas said that the question of likability always hangs over female characters in a way I've never seen haunting male protagonists in literature and film. Men get to be interesting and flawed as a matter of course, but the moment you have a woman or a girl up there center stage, suddenly the most important note is, well, is she likable? Will women be able to relate? And what I wonder as a writer is who is hanging likability out there over female characters? Who is it that's asking that question of writers? Who is it that cares and makes us think that we should care? And what I want to ask of all of you writers is to please don't get distracted by that question of likability or relatability when you're creating your characters. I don't really know that there are readers that aren't reading books because they're concerned they won't find a friend in the page. And if you get distracted by that, I think you find yourself in danger of being limited and accepting what Roxane Gay describes as the code of conduct that dictates the proper way to be and then the proper way to write. It's my position as a female writer who creates women in fiction that to address or consider likability or relatability is also to affirm the conceit that interesting, complex, flawed women characters are categorically unlikable. And for me, that's the central problem. Women and men, overreactors, mistake makers, trouble causers, these people are not unlikable people. I know them, I like them, I write about them. In many cases, I love them. And it's not that I dislike conventional or unimpeachable characters, it's not that I find those characters dull, which is often the accusation. It's that I simply do not find them. They literally don't exist. And that's because there aren't people who aren't like that. So I think you find that if you veer toward that, or if you're told to, your characters won't ring as true. There's this terrific essay on likability, and in it the writer Meredith Marin quotes Carol DeSanti, who's the vice president and editor-at-large of Viking Penguin. She says, there's a relationship between the characters women read and who we think we're allowed to be. What transpires on the page is not independent of the real world. The stories we produce, the characters we write, are necessarily tied up in a broader, consequential cultural directives regarding what acceptable women look like. And it's not only women. I mean, I'm using that example, but there are any other category of character that this can apply to. And they made what I especially want to add is, I'm not suggesting that characters shouldn't be likable or that they shouldn't be wonderful. And I think that there can be sort of a disconnect even within communities of women writers, there are women writers who feel that the worst thing they can do is write a likable narrator because then somehow it's not literary, or then somehow they're not writing someone complex. And so one of the things I want to say is that I don't want to suggest that women writers or male writers should or shouldn't write a likable woman, especially a likable woman. I think that there can be great characters who are likable and who you do want to be your friends, who are really heroines, true heroines. And I think that they can be interesting and complex as well. So I think that the main thing is to try not to let those thoughts or concerns infiltrate your creation of a character, and that the character be the complex, full human that you want them to be, whether or not they're relatable or likable. And that's become so much a part of the conversation in contemporary women's literature. And it really doesn't have a place in writing. We're not looking for characters we like or don't like. It shouldn't really even be a part of the conversation. In this class and in your writing life, you will talk and think a lot about identity, both your own as a creator, but also identity as it relates to the characters that you draw on the page. Issues of identity are not always straightforward, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the complications that you may face. Recently, the writer Lionel Shriver gave a talk about cultural appropriation in literature, and what she said, to summarize briefly, is that fiction writers shouldn't have to worry about cultural appropriation or what kinds of things they choose to write about, what sort of perspectives they choose to write about. They should be able to write about whatever they want, however they want. And at the heart of the conversation are some questions, including how can a writer know an experience well enough to write about it if she has not had that experience herself? And are there limits to what creative writers should or should not write? So I want to think a bit about this more specifically. The questions are, can a writer successfully fictionalize a character that is of a background entirely different from her own? And in particular, can and should a writer do so when the character is a member of a minority or an otherwise marginalized or disadvantaged group? And if the writer does choose to do that, what does she need to consider? Is it important that the stories of marginalized groups reach a readership, or is the essential thing that those stories be told by members of that specific community? Can a woman write well about a man, or a man about a woman? Can a white American woman write well about a Black American family? Could a straight man write well about a homosexual character? So these are kind of the questions that are very much at the front of the conversation in the literary community now, largely because of Lionel Shriver's talk. Before we go on, I want to give you a disclaimer, which is that I don't have any real answers for you. I have these important and necessary questions, and I have some ways that you may think about these things, but each of you must answer for yourself. So it is a fact of the vocation that we as creative writers must occupy mental and emotional spaces that are different from our own, right? That is a part of what we are doing. We write fiction. We make up stuff. We make up people. And we do this right out of thin air. We write characters that have suffered losses that are different from our own. We write characters that face challenges that are different from our own. This is what we are here to do. And it's complicated and nuanced and important. And it's our obligation to think critically about our creative choices. So first, I'll describe the problems a little bit and then talk about some ways that we might think about them. It's important to remember certain writers occupy a position of greater cultural and historical privilege than others. This privilege can provide any number of advantages, not the least of which is greater access to publication or readership. And it's our responsibility, each of us, to assess privilege for and of ourselves. Because entrenched or deeply internalized privilege can cause a writer to be insensitive to what it might be like to live as a person whose voice is ignored or muzzled. And that insensitivity can make it difficult to successfully or considerately create minority or marginalized characters in fiction. The writer Foz Meadows says, when writers decide to speak for and about more marginalized groups, that can have a material impact on the ability of those groups to speak for themselves and be heard, especially if their personal accounts differ, as they invariably do, from those of more prominent outsiders. The complication is that when we write from the point of view of others, we might filter those experiences through our own skewed or biased lens, and that can result in diminishment or worse, stereotyping or even appropriating another group's story. So there are two ways to think about how and what can happen when we make these kinds of creative choices. There are issues of craft, and then there are issues of cultural identity. No matter the identity, questions will always come up regarding the writing itself. Is the character alive? Is the character vivid and dynamic and persuasive? That is a craft conversation, and it happens in a class, in a workshop, between writers, with an editor, sometimes with a critic. How well, how fully is the fictional human being drawn? But there is also the consideration, what are the implications regarding the character's representation of a minority, marginalized, or disadvantaged group or identity? As readers and writers, we want to encourage a great diversity of story. We want different cultures to enrich one another. We want the kind of conversations that take place when varied human beings intersect, be it a writer with their characters or different characters within a book, or readers discovering a new fictionalized world on the page. Works of creative writing can increase compassion, sympathy, understanding, and tolerance. But we, the creators, must think hard about questions of racism, misogyny, homophobia, stereotypes of all kinds, as well as questions about history and immigration. So to be clear, I'm not suggesting that social justice must or should be your purpose as a writer. Only that if you're going to include a character who is wildly different from yourself, you the writer, then you are taking on a responsibility to think about those things carefully and to be attentive to what you are doing and how you are doing it. Our work has implications, and we need to be thoughtful about what those are. It's my position that a writer should feel she can write about anything. We are creative artists. We are bound to create, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to do that well if we feel restricted. We adopt personas, and it's true we use fictional characters to tell stories that we believe to be important. That kind of usage is not necessarily problematic. We're expected to use these personas and characters and identities for our creative ends. We inhabit other people. We should, and we must. But it is the manner in which we do so, and as importantly, the manner in which we think about these creative acts and what they represent and teach and claim in the wider context that makes the difference. I'll say what I have said before. What transpires on the page is not independent of the real world. The stories that we produce and the characters we write aren't necessarily tied up in broader, consequential cultural concerns. So this is the best that I can do for an answer. A writer must self-assess and must bring careful, critical thought to what she puts on the page, no matter her larger purpose or objective with a creative project. If she makes the choice to include a diversity of characters, and therefore characters unlike herself, she must do so with respect, care, and more than likely some research. This kind of careful consideration can only make a project better and more successful, and it can only bring authenticity, consciousness, and humanity to the work. So my advice to you is to think hard and to write well.